Shortly before dusk on the 22nd of April 1915, Canadian infantry near the Belgian town of Ypres heard the distinctive rumble of enemy gunfire, heralding the start of yet another battle on the Western Front. Moments later, a mysterious cloud with a yellow and green tint was seen slowly drifting across no man's land. Those men weren't to know it, but they were witnessing the dawn of a new age of combat, chemical warfare. Many types of chemicals were used throughout the war, but we'll focus on just three: chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas. On that spring day, more than 5,000 cylinders dug into the front of German trenches released 168 tons of chlorine gas on their unsuspecting enemy opposite this stretch of ground in the infamous Ypres salient. The results were horrific. One British soldier witnessed that moment.
Trundling along with the wind came the queer fog that seemed strangely out of place in the bright atmosphere of that clear April day. It reached the parapet, paused, gathered itself like a wave and ponderously lapped over into the trenches. Then passive curiosity turned to active torment. A burning sensation in the head, red-hot needles in the lungs, the throat seized as by a strangler. Many fell and died on the spot.
But how and why did this awful new weapon appear on the battlefield? To answer that vital question, we need to go back in time a little. By early 1915, the Western Front had stagnated into stalemate along a 450-mile line of hastily constructed trenches. The German plan to knock France out of the war had failed, and both sides dug in as best they could. This left Germany in the ominous position of facing a war on two fronts, something it was desperate to avoid. The problem though was this: determined defenders in well-sighted positions, backed up with machine guns, artillery and barbed wire, were extremely difficult to dislodge, and breakthroughs, such as that the Germans needed, were very difficult to achieve. For that, a new weapon was required to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Enter Professor Fritz Haber, a highly complex character. Of German-Jewish origin, he was an eminent chemist, a winner of the Nobel Prize for synthesizing fertilizer which revolutionized agriculture the world over. His work would later lead to the creation of Zyklon B, a pesticide which would be used to exterminate his own people under Nazi rule. But before that, in 1915, he would take the dubious credit for weaponizing lethal chemicals on an industrial scale. It was under Haber's supervision that Germany first began to develop chemical weapons for use on the battlefield. The idea was quite straightforward: create a noxious chemical agent which could be released by cylinder and carried by the wind into enemy positions, sinking into their trenches, killing or incapacitating them, thus allowing troops with respirators to advance behind the gas and break through the enemy lines. It had huge potential. When that chlorine gas was first released in cloud form against the French-Algerian 45th Division on the first day of the Second Battle of Ypres, it had a huge effect. It sowed chaos and confusion throughout the ranks, causing many to flee their positions to avoid the discoloured cloud with its powerful odour of bleach. The result was a huge gap opening in the Allied line and the very real possibility of breakthrough. But what did it do to those who were unfortunate enough to be in its path? Most of us have experienced the noxious effects of chlorine before. Ever been to a swimming pool and had that stinging sensation for staying in the water a little too long? This is caused by chlorine, but it's in a concentration between 1 and 3 parts per million. The chlorine gas used at 2nd Ypres was pure, 100% concentration. On a biological level, the chemical invades the nose, throat and lungs, causing a burning sensation which in turn forces the lungs to produce acidic water, and the victim eventually dies painfully through drowning in their own bodily fluids. A horrific way to perish. That first attack was so successful that the Germans themselves were surprised. By the time they realised there was a huge undefended gap ahead of them, both Canadian and British troops had been brought in to fill the void and the opportunity was lost. But those events left the British with a major problem. Several million men were entrenched along the Western Front with absolutely no defence against this new threat. Something was needed, and needed now. A quick point here: contrary to popular belief, this attack was not a complete surprise to the Allies. Most nations had already experimented with non-lethal gases such as tear gas, and in the days preceding the attack, German prisoners had been captured with rudimentary respirators. What is remarkable is the speed at which the defenders reacted to this threat. Serving men who had a background in chemistry worked out that chlorine was being used. One man, Canadian Lieutenant Colonel George Naismith, collected samples of the gas and immediately briefed General Headquarters, along with the advice that soaking bandages or strips of cloth could provide basic protection against chlorine. But it led Field Marshal Sir John French to report to the War Office on the 23rd of April that
it is essential that our troops should be immediately provided with means of counteracting the effects of enemy gases, which should be suitable for use when on the move. As a temporary measure, I am arranging for troops in the trenches to be supplied with a solution of bicarbonate of soda in which to soak handkerchiefs.
On the very same day, a central laboratory was established at Saint-Omer where chemists serving in France and Belgium were drawn in and set the daunting task of providing countermeasures en masse to eliminate this new and terrible threat. The team assembled were led by this man, Colonel William Horrocks, based at the Royal Army Medical College in Millbank, who achieved an astonishing feat by producing 300,000 cotton-padded masks in the first week and almost 2 million within a month. These could be tied around the head after being soaked in sodium bicarbonate, the idea being that the gas molecules would stick to the outside of the mask as the wearer inhaled. But these were very limited and after a short time became saturated and ineffective. Back in London, Professor Herbert Baker at Imperial College took this a step further to improve protection, developing the Black Veil mask, which was soaked with photographic hypo solution. Concurrent work in France progressed the design to bring out the hypo or smoke hood, and unbelievably, this was all done within a month of the first use of gas. The stakes were incredibly high, as many in the medical services had seen firsthand. Let's hear from Nurse Edith Appleton at number 3 Casualty Clearing Station, just behind the front lines.
A very busy day with 5 cases in theatre and wards full of gas poisoning victims. They're fearfully sad to see. The slight ones look rather like pneumonia, and the bad ones are terrible. The poor things are blue and gasping, lungs full of liquid and not able to cough it up. Today 6 have died in one ward alone. This gas poisoning is a horrible business.
Inevitably, the British retaliated with a gas attack of their own at Loos in September 1915. By now, the goggle-eyed phenate or P helmet had been developed, which afforded better protection, albeit they were uncomfortable to wear, often leaked, and made communications difficult. Here lies arguably the most important change chemical warfare brought to the battlefield, not necessarily by killing, but by drastically reducing the enemy's effectiveness. By deploying gas, or even appearing to, an attacker could force their enemy to don a cumbersome hood or mask. This made everything more difficult. Early masks steamed up, had terrible peripheral vision, were hot, uncomfortable, and made it impossible to eat or drink, and of course much more difficult to fight. The result was a marked reduction in combat efficiency every time gas was used. The Battle of Loos itself is surrounded by a number of controversies, and the well-narrated story is that chlorine gas blew back on British troops when the wind direction changed. Well, yes, this was true, and the number of casualties was probably somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000, just under 5% of all casualties in the battle. But officially there were only 7 recorded British deaths in the aftermath of Loos due to gas. Surely there were more who succumbed out in no man's land and were never found. But by the time the British used chlorine at Loos in September 1915, the Germans were already looking to use a much more toxic gas, phosgene. Let's pause the action right here for a moment to talk about today's sponsors, without whom we couldn't make videos like this. We've teamed up with CuriosityStream, an award-winning platform offering original documentary films, shows and series that you simply can't find anywhere else. They have a huge library of content ranging from science and nature to technology and military history, with new content released each week. Amongst the many excellent documentary series to watch are the epic Apocalypse World War I and World War II series. With plans starting at under $5 a month, it's also eminently affordable and can be viewed via TV, computer or mobile device. Go to curiositystream.com/battleguide or scan the QR code for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for our fans, use promo code BATTLEGUIDE and you'll save 25% off. So click the link below or go to curiositystream.com/battleguide and save 25% right now. So, back to the story. Phosgene had very different impact on the human body to chlorine, being 6 to 10 times more toxic. It also had a relatively benign smell and was colourless, so it was difficult to detect. although a number of veterans reflected that smokers could discern an odd flavour to their tobacco in the presence of the gas. It produced a slight irritation to the lungs, which meant that the victim would breathe more in, but the effects took time to show, and often victims would die 24 to 48 hours after being gassed. When phosgene was first used across these fields in front of Ypres on the 19th of December 1915, some 177 tons of a chlorine-phosgene mix was released towards the British. Fortunately, complete disaster was averted as the P helmet offered just enough protection against phosgene, and consequently only 1,069 casualties were sustained, of which 120 were fatal. Shortly after this, another chemical, hexamine, was added to the phenate hood to create the PH helmet, which offered much better protection against phosgene. Whilst the early focus was on the development of a P helmet, a small team worked on the concept of a tower filter respirator. This allowed different chemical filters to be stacked in a tube, offering much better resilience to a range of gases. This eventually became the small box respirator, or SBR, which was issued from September 1916 and was a game changer in terms of gas protection. It was so effective that the Germans gave up on cloud gas attacks after its introduction and switched to deployment of gas by shell. When it came to using the SBR, speed was the key. Men regularly trained behind the lines to put on gas masks as quickly and securely as possible, as a few seconds or a single lungful of gas could mean the difference between life and death. So great was the need for SBRs that Tottenham Hotspur's football stadium White Hart Lane was requisitioned and 50,000 SBRs were produced there every day. Over 16 million were issued during the course of the war. The introduction of the SBR in the game of tit for tat played out on the Western Front marked a new phase in the war. In a particularly horrific development, another lethal poison, diphosgene, was introduced alongside a vomiting agent which forced soldiers to remove their respirators, only then to be gassed by something far more toxic. Even the SBR, though, could not prevent casualties with the next escalation in gas warfare: mustard gas. In July 1917, Germans introduced mustard gas, or Ypres, which, despite its name, is not really a gas. This was a vesicant or blistering agent in the form of an oily liquid, but gaseous for a period following an explosive dispersal from a shell. The usual delivery method was by artillery. Shells were fired over enemy positions with an airburst fuse, thereby dispersing the substance over a wide area. The SBR prevented inhalation of the vapour and protected the eyes, but mustard burned the skin and caused blistering. It was also very persistent and could remain toxic on the ground for weeks. Let's consider another important factor with mustard gas: area denial. The effects of mustard gas could decimate the fighting strength of British units. One battalion, the 1st Battalion Hertfordshire Regiment, found themselves caught in a mustard gas barrage behind their own front lines on the 11th of May 1918 near the village of Fonquivière. Captain Anthony Grinling remembered the events.
The village was being gas-shelled at the time, and despite a warning to divisional staff as to the difficulties of reaching the portion of the line intended for us to take over while the gas shelling continued, they insisted that we should take up our position. Finding an unrequited portion of the line in the dark, wearing a gas helmet, with gas shells bursting all the time, was a pretty difficult thing to do. The result was nearly every man in the entire battalion was gassed, including every officer from the colonel downwards.
Of the 513 men in the battalion at the time, a staggering 511 were hospitalised. However, relatively few deaths occurred from mustard gas. Perhaps the most well-known effect was temporary blindness. Men in photographs with bandages across their eyes, often amongst our first thoughts when we consider gas in the First World War, but almost invariably they recovered their sight and could eventually return to duty. This idea of sapping enemy strength, though, is important and worth consideration. Remember, the aim of the game from 1916 onwards on both sides was attrition, reduce the enemy's fighting strength. Gas was incredibly effective at this. Take away a soldier's eyesight and now not only can he no longer fight, but at least one other man must leave the firing line to guide him to the rear. In an effort to reduce this attrition, long lines would be formed, with a man putting his arm on the shoulder of the soldier to his front, with one fully sighted man leading the entire group to the rear and medical attention. Until the end of the war, mustard gas presented the medical services with the problem of not just treating the wounded, but also avoiding getting contaminated themselves at the same time. The use of poison gas on its own in the First War did not contribute to any single great strategic achievement, nor did it kill soldiers at the same level as artillery, machine gun and rifle fire, but it did become another brutal weapon in the arsenal of both sides. So how many soldiers died due to gas? The numbers are difficult to pin down, and we have to remember that records can only be measured of those passing through a medical facility. So let's have a look at the official casualty figures, which you may find surprising. The total British and Empire soldiers who were gassed was around 186,000, almost 10% of the roughly 2 million British battle casualties treated on the Western Front during the war. Of that number, only 6,062 gas deaths were registered, less than 1% of all fatalities. By far the most common gas to cause a casualty was mustard, accounting for almost 125,000 injuries, but it killed a very low number, around 2,300. So as a general rule, mustard injured more people, but phosgene was far more deadly. But these figures do not emphasize the key attribute of gas. Its presence on the battlefield invoked fear. Fear of being robbed of your ability to breathe, fear of being burnt and blistered, a fear of an enemy which could strike almost any place at any time. General John Pershing addressed US Congress in 1919 and said the following:
"Whether or not gas will be employed in future wars is a matter of conjecture, but the effect is so deadly to the unprepared that we can never afford to neglect the question."
Finally, to add to that toll of those who suffered from gas warfare are a much larger, completely unknown number. Men who returned home after the war and died months, years, or even decades later, having suffered the long-lasting effects of chemical warfare. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it interesting, you can check out our other videos right here on YouTube. And if you'd like to support us in our work to share more history of this kind, please check out our Patreon at the link below. Your support is hugely appreciated. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.